William Harrison sat in his sleek, polished office, staring at the glowing screen in front of him. His company, Harrison Industries, had grown exponentially over the years. As the CEO, he had navigated the challenges of the business world with a keen sense of strategy and ambition. He had built an empire. But as the company expanded, something began to gnaw at him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The higher he climbed, the more disconnected he felt from the people who made his success possible. He was no longer involved in the day-to-day operations, no longer interacting with the employees who worked tirelessly to keep the wheels turning. He began to hear whispers about growing dissatisfaction within the ranks, but those were easy to ignore. After all, the company was thriving, the profits were up, and he had a new set of challenges to face. Yet, despite all the success, William felt uneasy. Was everything really as perfect as it seemed? He wondered what the employees really thought of him, of the company, and of the corporate culture he had helped shape. Were they just working for a paycheck, or did they feel valued? Were they happy? The nagging feeling wouldn't go away. So William decided to do something radical. He would go undercover. For 1 week, he would live among his employees, experiencing their daily routines and seeing the company through their eyes. He would take on a completely different role, one that was far removed from the CEO title. A janitor. The idea came to him in a flash, and the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. No one would recognize him. He would be just another faceless worker blending into the background, learning the truth without the filters of management or preconceived notions. This wasn't about gathering information to make himself look good. It was about understanding what was really happening within the company. He needed to know if his employees were content, and if not, what he could do to change that. He spent the next few days planning the logistics, arranging for a janitorial uniform, creating a new email address under a fake name, and scheduling his shifts around the usual hours. It was going to be hard work, physically demanding and mentally exhausting. But he was ready. Before he could begin, he reached out to a trusted friend who worked in human resources to make sure his cover wouldn't be blown. The plan was simple: stay under the radar, keep a low profile, and observe the company from the ground level. No one would know who he really was. The challenge now was to maintain his anonymity while absorbing everything he could about the inner workings of Harrison Industries. As he finalized the details, a sense of anticipation began to build inside him. He had never felt so disconnected from the heart of his company, and he was determined to fix that. He needed to know the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The following Monday, William suited up in his janitor's uniform, a simple set of overalls with a name tag that read Tommy. He was about to embark on a journey that would open his eyes in ways he never imagined. His mission was clear: to learn what his employees truly thought of the company and what kind of changes, if any, were needed. As he entered the building, he was filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The first step into the unknown had begun. The first day in his new role was nothing short of surreal. William had traded his sharp suit and polished shoes for a janitor's uniform, complete with scuffed shoes and an old mop bucket. He was no longer the CEO of Harrison Industries. He was just another faceless worker, blending into the background. The excitement that had initially gripped him soon gave way to a feeling of unease. For the first time in years, he felt like a stranger in his own company. The shift started early, just before dawn, when the office was still empty, and the world hadn't yet begun its busy hum. William entered through the back service door, which was always locked to the general public, but now seemed like his new point of entry. It was a modest beginning. He walked down the long, cold hallway, clutching a mop and bucket in his hands. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an unflattering glow on everything. The building smelled faintly of stale coffee and dust, nothing like the polished, pristine office he had grown accustomed to. His first task was to clean the break room. He pushed his cart down the hall, hoping no one would notice him. He had to remind himself that his true mission wasn't to do the job well or impress anyone with his skills. It was to observe, to understand what it really took to keep the wheels of the company turning. He needed to know what his employees experienced every day without the filter of the boardroom or management team. As he moved quietly through the break room, mopping the floors and wiping down tables, he noticed how little attention he was paid. The usual hum of corporate life was absent. The space was sterile, quiet, as if it too was waiting for something to break the monotony. No one acknowledged him as he moved around, and that was precisely what he wanted. But it wasn't long before he began to hear the murmurs. His presence had gone unnoticed by most, but there were a few employees in the break room, chatting quietly over their morning coffee. One woman, Sarah from the marketing team, sat at the far end of the room, her voice a little louder than the others. William couldn't help but overhear her conversation with a colleague. "I can't believe they keep us here for hours and no one cares," Sarah said, rubbing her temples in frustration. "No one listens. They just keep piling on more work. I'm exhausted, and all the CEO cares about is the bottom line." William's heart sank. It wasn't that he didn't know these issues existed. It was that hearing them firsthand was different. He had always assumed that things were running smoothly. He'd never seen or heard the struggles of his employees from their perspective. To him, everything had always been about growth, expansion, and profits. But to Sarah and to so many others, the company's growth had come at the expense of their well-being. He moved quietly, careful not to make a sound as he worked. The conversation continued, and with each word, he felt more aware of how disconnected he had become. He had been so wrapped up in his role as CEO, managing deals and corporate strategies, that he had failed to notice the emotional toll it was taking on his employees. Later that morning, as he cleaned the restrooms, he overheard another conversation, this time between two custodians who worked in the building. "You know, I've been here for years and nothing ever changes," one of them said, shaking his head. "We're just treated like invisible people. We do all the hard work, but no one ever notices. If we're lucky, we get a thank you once in a while." William paused for a moment, gripping the handle of his mop tightly. He couldn't deny it. The people in this building, the ones who kept it running, felt invisible. They felt like their efforts went unnoticed, like they didn't matter. As he worked through the day, mopping the floors of hallways and meeting rooms, William began to see his company from a completely different perspective. The people who made the company run weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They were human beings. The lack of recognition, the exhaustion, the isolation, they were all very real, and they had become part of the fabric of the company he had built. That afternoon, as William took a short break in the maintenance closet, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The reality was far from what he had expected. He had spent so much time building his empire, so focused on the next deal, the next expansion, that he had missed the human side of the company, the side that needed attention, care, and respect, the side that had been neglected in favor of profits and success. William realized that this experience was exactly what he needed. It wasn't just about cleaning floors or washing windows. It was about seeing the company in its rawest form. He had to understand what was happening beneath the surface if he wanted to fix it. And now, with each task completed and each overheard conversation, he was beginning to understand just how much work there was to do. The following days of William's undercover operation were no less eye-opening. Every time he walked through the building as a janitor, he felt more and more like a spectator of a silent war. It wasn't a battle fought with words, but with small actions, exhaustion, and resentment. And as much as William tried to ignore it, the harsh realities of his employees' lives continued to surface. His usual interactions with the staff, when he was in his CEO role, had always been formal. Business meetings, boardrooms, polite smiles and handshakes. It wasn't that he'd ever intended to distance himself, but in his world, there was always a sense of separation. He had never truly seen the everyday struggles of his team. But now, working in the trenches with them, the full weight of their lives outside of work came into sharp focus. By day 3, William had already overheard more than he thought possible. In the break room, a group of marketing employees were discussing their personal lives, but the conversation quickly shifted to work. One employee, a young man named James, spoke bitterly about how the company had cut back on benefits. "I'm telling you, it's like they don't care anymore," James said, his voice thick with frustration. "We're getting paid less for doing more, the bonuses gone. And now we're expected to work overtime without any kind of appreciation. I don't even know why I stay." William had expected some complaints. Every company faced them. But hearing this, especially from someone who seemed to have potential and enthusiasm, hit him harder than he had anticipated. This was the reality for his employees. A world of cutbacks, endless expectations, and growing dissatisfaction. That same afternoon, William found himself in the office of one of the senior custodians, a man named Hector, who had been cleaning alongside him. The two had exchanged pleasantries, but it was during a brief break that Hector opened up about the harsh realities of his job. "We're not even acknowledged, you know," Hector muttered as he sat on a maintenance bench, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've worked here for over 20 years. And I don't even get a thank you from the management. They treat us like we're invisible, like our work doesn't count." The words stung. William had always prided himself on building a company that cared about success and innovation. But in all of this, he had failed to see the people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the custodians, the maintenance staff, the team members who weren't in the boardroom. They were the foundation of the company. And yet, they were the most overlooked. Later that evening, as he was emptying trash bins in the hallways, William saw the upper management team walking out of the executive meeting. They were chatting among themselves, unaware of the lone janitor silently cleaning nearby. His gaze lingered on them for a moment, and he realized that despite their accomplishments, they too were just as detached as he had been. They lived in a bubble, oblivious to the reality their employees faced every day. That night, as he returned to his small apartment, William couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of guilt. It was more than just the mistreatment he had overheard. It was the realization that he, too, had become part of the problem. He had grown so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, achieving goals, and making deals that he had allowed the very people who built the company to be ignored and undervalued. But now, having seen everything with his own eyes, he knew something had to change. He couldn't go back to business as usual. His undercover mission was only just beginning, but he had already made a commitment to himself. He would change the way his company treated its employees, from the janitor to the highest executive. It was time to stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution. As the days wore on, William found himself becoming more entrenched in his undercover role. The initial shock of his experience had faded, but the weight of his observations remained. The more he witnessed, the more he realized how deeply disconnected he had been from the heart of his company. Each conversation he overheard, each interaction with an employee, revealed more about the systemic issues that had plagued the company for years. By now, William had spent a full week in his janitor's role. The monotonous cleaning duties were beginning to wear on him physically, but the emotional toll was what truly drained him. The more he saw, the more he understood the fragile morale of his team. He saw it in the way employees moved through the halls, head down, shoulders slumped, barely meeting each other's eyes. They weren't just working for a paycheck. They were surviving each day, barely holding on. The most troubling thing William noticed was the lack of communication between management and the lower-level staff. The executives passed through the halls with their well-tailored suits and their world of big deals, ignoring the staff who kept the building running. The staff, in turn, had no voice, no avenue to express their frustrations. There were no open-door policies for them. Their complaints and concerns were buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, invisible to the people who had the power to fix things. One afternoon, while he was cleaning the office of the head of human resources, William overheard a conversation between two junior employees, Tina and Greg, who worked in administration. "I can't keep doing this, Greg," Tina said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I'm burned out. They've got me working overtime every week, and it's never enough. No one ever thanks us. It's like we don't even matter." Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "I hear you, but what can we do? They won't listen. They only care about the bottom line. We're just cogs in the machine to them." William paused as he pushed the mop across the floor, the sound of the conversation cutting through the silence. He wasn't surprised by what they said, but hearing it firsthand made it all the more real. It wasn't just a handful of disgruntled employees. It was a pattern, a systemic issue of neglect and mistreatment. The truth was clear. The company had become too focused on its own success, its own growth, to notice the cracks in its foundation. The employees who were making it all happen day in and day out were being ignored, burned out, and left to fend for themselves. Their concerns were dismissed and their contributions undervalued. But it wasn't just the employees who were suffering. William realized that the lack of recognition and respect wasn't only damaging the workers, it was damaging the company as a whole. The employees who felt invisible and underappreciated were the ones who made the company function. And when they were disillusioned, when they felt like their work didn't matter, it affected the quality of their work, the morale of the entire company, and ultimately, its success. The weight of this realization hit William hard. It wasn't just about improving the work environment, it was about rebuilding the entire culture of the company. The company needed to learn how to value its employees again, how to create a workplace where everyone felt respected and heard. William was determined to change things, but it wasn't going to be easy. He had spent years building his career and his company in a way that had overlooked the importance of those at the bottom. Now he had to dismantle the very systems that had allowed this culture to persist. He had to become the change he wanted to see in the company. But he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the people he had neglected for so long, and he had a responsibility to make it right. The morning after his undercover week as a janitor, William walked into the building with a newfound sense of purpose. The experience had changed him. It had opened his eyes to the harsh realities his employees faced every day. It wasn't just about profit margins and boardroom meetings anymore. It was about people, about valuing their work and their well-being. He couldn't go back to business as usual. William knew the changes had to start with him. It was time to confront his senior leadership team and make them understand that the company's success depended not just on the bottom line, but on creating a healthy, supportive environment for everyone. His first step was clear. He called an emergency meeting with the executives. As the leadership team gathered in the conference room, there was an air of uncertainty. William had been quiet the past week, and they weren't sure what to expect from him. When he entered, he didn't take his usual seat at the head of the table. Instead, he stood at the front, facing his team, with a stern expression that immediately set the tone for the meeting. "I've just spent a week working undercover," William began, his voice steady but firm. "I spent that week as a janitor in this building, doing the very work that many of you have forgotten exists. I've seen what's happening on the ground. I've heard the frustration, the exhaustion, the resentment. I've seen what happens when a company focuses solely on growth, profits, and expansion, while ignoring the very people who make that success possible. The room was silent. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of where this conversation was going. William could feel the weight of their gaze, but he pressed on. "We've become a company that values success at any cost," he continued. "And in doing so, we've lost sight of what really matters: the people. Our employees are not just workers. They're the backbone of this company, and we've been treating them as if they don't matter." He paused, letting the words sink in. He could see the discomfort on the faces of the senior leaders, but there was also something else, something he hadn't seen before. It was the beginning of realization. They understood that this wasn't just a critique, it was a wake-up call. "We're going to change," William said, his voice stronger now. "Effective immediately, we are implementing new policies that prioritize the well-being of every employee, regardless of their position. We will ensure that our lower-level staff, like custodians and maintenance workers, are recognized and valued. We will open up communication channels for all employees to express their concerns without fear of retaliation, and we will create a culture that is inclusive, supportive, and respectful." There was a long pause as the executives absorbed his words. Then, slowly, the nods began. One by one, the senior leadership team began to speak. Agreeing with William's vision, they understood now that they had failed to address the most important issue: their employees. The people who worked tirelessly, day in and day out, to make Harrison Industries successful had been neglected, their voices silenced. The rest of the meeting was a blur as William outlined the specifics of the new initiatives. But one thing was clear: a change was coming. A change that would not just affect the company's bottom line, but would transform the culture from the ground up. And it all started with a CEO who finally understood the value of listening. As the meeting ended and the team filed out, William stood alone in the conference room for a moment, letting the gravity of the decision settle in. The work ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and commitment. But for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that this was the right direction. He wasn't just leading a company anymore. He was leading a movement toward something better. That evening, as he returned home, William couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his decision. He had made mistakes, but this was his chance to make things right, not just for himself, but for his employees, his company, and the future. And for Elijah, his son, he knew he had done something important. He had shown him the value of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. He had shown him that leadership was about more than just making money. It was about making a difference.